Rachel Smalley's On the Record this week looks at the challenges facing the brand new National Party president, Sylvia Wood, who's barely got her foot in the door before being faced with the Sam Uffindell crisis. Rachel, you've spoken to Sylvia. What kind of welcome do you think it's been for her?
Gosh, well, it's interesting, Dita, because it's not her. It's not her debut necessarily into the party, but it certainly is as the National Party president. And she, like the rest of the National Party, came off that annual conference in Christchurch recently feeling fairly buoyed. I interviewed her and she struck me as, I think I said, a woman of grit. And she had told every National MP that they had to have an obsessive focus on the party vote this year. She has a background in employment law, human resources. She's very experienced in that space, which I think is going to serve her well.
Indeed.
As she now looks at the situation that she had on. I spoke to her on the Monday morning. By that afternoon, she had her sleeves rolled up and was dealing with the revelations that had come out about Sam Uffindell. So, pretty big task ahead of her, but I would think the first task is looking at the candidate selection process and what's involved with that.
Absolutely. Let's talk about your reaction to the story. According to the column, you first sort of gave him the benefit of the doubt, but you've changed your mind since.
Yeah, I did, because I don't think as adults we can sort of retrofit today's values onto children and teens. And I also think you must provide space for redemption and forgiveness. Otherwise, what is the point of apologising, or what is the point of learning and growing? So I do believe quite strongly in that. I went with my gut. I felt that although the timing of his apology, some would argue, was quite cynical just before he went into politics, I did think his apology appeared genuine. And sometimes we get to stages in our life where we think, actually, you know, I do need to apologise. And I felt he was authentic in that space. But I guess when the second revelation came out, then I started to move in my thinking, because he is an MP. You know, he is charged with doing good, you know, on behalf of the public. And I think for me, when those revelations came out, and I from a flatmate in Otago, and I listened to her interview, and I think that's crucial here, when I listened to her speak on RNZ and her father speak, I started to think that there was probably a pattern of behaviour here, and that she hadn't ever heard from him and there hadn't been an apology. And I think that was twofold. I think he has to go for the National Party, because this will plague them forevermore. Yes. And you, I think, want flawed and MPs who have life experience, because I think you learn from that.
Yes.
But this started to make me feel quite uncomfortable. And I think looking through it through the lens of a woman and the lens of the mother of a 13-year-old, I think that started to change my perspective a little as well. So I think Luxons, you know, taken some good early steps here.
Yes, I was going to talk about Luxon's performance over this time. You think he's coped quite well with it?
Yeah, I have. I do think he has coped quite well. And it's interesting that when you see him respond, certainly this week, he looks like his feet are pretty grounded. What he's saying, certainly as someone who's worked in the space of communications, I think he believes. And I think probably he's leaning into, I would suspect, as a New Zealand CEO, he would have had an enormous amount of crisis management training and comms training. I was in France some years ago when the Air New Zealand plane went down and reported on that in Perpignan. That was with Rob Fife. And I think that certainly would have created an understanding for future CEOs that they really need to be aware of how to respond in a situation like that. So comparatively, this is, you know, small beer for Luxon, but I think he's learned in the space of crisis communications. I think he knows the outcome already. But he did two things which I think were quite important. He announced that there would be an inquiry, and he gave a time to that. So that's afforded him a break. He can reference that, look, this is before a QC, you know, we're going to get the full information. Also remember that Sam Uffindell has rejected and declined and says that what went on in Otago, he rejects those allegations. So, there's not a lot he can say. But he's been strong and solid. He says they're serious allegations and he's going to get to the bottom of it, and he's taken action. And that's what I think is really important here.
I wonder if, as a journalist, like we both are, there's a sense that maybe this is not quite played out completely yet. Do you think Luxon will suffer for this at the next election?
As you say, we've got a year to go to the next election. If he manages it well, depending on whatever decision he makes around Uffindell, if he manages it well, I think he could come through fairly well through this. If he acts decisively. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because, and I suspect our audience here on MBR may have a different view, because, some who vote National will think that Sam Uffindell should be allowed to retain his position. They will agree with me in part what I have said as well, which is you shouldn't be judged today by the actions of, yourself as a teenager and a child. I do think what he has is alleged to have done in Otago is much more complex. So that's why I don't think he can stay on in this role. But I don't think it will hurt Luxon if he manages it well. And I think if you've read Andrea Vance's Blue Blood book,
yes.
There's some very good. She got her hands on some pretty good documentation, including the review of what went wrong in National's election campaign in 2020. And in there it talked about key issues: lack of leadership, bad actors in the party, and behaviour that wasn't got on top of quickly. So I suspect Luxon understands all of that, and his advisors will be saying to him, act swift, fail fast, as they say, get on top of it quickly. And if he does that, I think it would serve him well heading into the election.
And puts future recruits through the Uffindell Test.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I think.
Yes.
I think you can hold that up as a precedent, and whenever a new candidate, and that's for Labour as well as any of the other parties as well outside of National, would you pass the Uffindell Test? And surely candidates will think twice about just what's in their background before they apply to be an MP.
Rachel, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks, Dita.